All right, I think we have a good group to kick off. So thanks everyone for joining us this morning for the first innovation workshop of Genesis 2021. I'm very excited to have this topic to be covered as a kickoff because it's obviously a big prospective talk and talking about how future may look like in our industry, which is a lot what Genesis is about. So I think it's a great way to do that. So I'll pass the mic over to Adrian in a minute, but just a few housekeeping rules from me. If you can just keep your microphones and camera off just during the presentation, that will just be helpful for being a bit less disruptive and hearing from the talk. But obviously we want that to be as interactive as possible. So if you have any comment or question, just drop that in the chat box and I will monitor that and pass it on to the presenters. So I think we're ready for an exciting presentation on the 5 trends reshaping the future of MedTech. And I'm passing the microphone and Zoom floor to Adrian to start on that. Adrian.
Hi there. Well, thank you very much and welcome everyone. So yes, my name is Adrian Bennett. I'm an audit partner based in EY's Cambridge office with a speciality and focus on life sciences companies, including pharmaceuticals, MedTech, biotech, etc. So delighted you can join us here today. I'm also joined by 2 of my colleagues who I'll let introduce themselves shortly, but James Evans and Laura Letts, who work with me in the sector, and James has also been key in the development of the report itself. So we lots of insights from James, which I hope are helpful for people. So just before I hand over to my colleagues to introduce themselves, I just thought I'd sort of paint a bit of a backdrop to this and give you some context. So this presentation that we're going to give really is a summary and kind of sets out some of the highlights of a report. This is our Pulse Industry report, which provides an overview of the medtech industry, which was published or is published annually at the Aid for Med's MedTech conference. And the report summarizes effectively the medical technologies, industry's performance, financial performance, financing and M&A and other core metrics, as well as reviewing the trends driving change within the sector. And this 15th edition, which was published at the 2021 conference, was held in September to September 30th, and part virtually and part in person in Minneapolis. So it's kind of making all the best of COVID. Some people there, some people not, in virtual, so hybrid kind of working, if you will. And the addition of this report, I would say, also gives us a bit of an opportunity to look at the impact of COVID on the industry as well. So, you know, it is an interesting report. I think what you'll see is that we've stratified it into 5 key mega trends that we're seeing driving the industry. So one is something we call human-centric, really. It's all about being rather patient-centric, being the need to integrate patient-centric technologies into their business. Data and digital migration, so huge volumes of data are being created, obviously, in the industry, and how the industry goes about harnessing that and using it for better patient outcomes. Some regulatory developments and some real opportunities in here for medtech companies, so we'll focus a little on that. And then supply chain, need to adapt supply chains to deliver these most personalized products that are patient-centric, making use of data, but making supply chains more resilient. And again, of course, because of COVID, we've seen the importance of that. And then finally, sustainability. Sustainable business practices are kind of critical to long-term value. They're attracting regulatory attention of investors, stakeholders, and so it's imperative that the developments that take place in this industry, as in any other, are based on sustainable principles. And interestingly, despite COVID, this has been a really exciting year, as you'll see, for the industry in terms of R&D, valuation and investment. And I think COVID has not only accelerated certain trends, it's also creating further opportunities for the industry. But with that, and kind of that little synopsis, I'll hand over to Laura and James to take you through the detail of the report.
Great, thanks, Adrian. Hi, everyone. Just as an introduction, I'm Laura Letts. I'm a tax director working across the Golden Triangle, really, for EY. I've spent the last 15 years working with fast growth companies across the sector. So really pleased to be with you today. If I jump in, the pulse of the industry, James, if we flip on a slide. The Pulse of the Industry report really highlights, I think, a number of key findings for the medtech industry. And as we've come out of COVID and really through the last year, there have been a number of trends that have really highlighted the resiliency of the medtech industry, and I think the opportunity going forward. You know, the medtech industry is now approaching $500 billion of revenue, and that's quite incredible. And this is growing. You know, in the first half of 21, we've seen an increase of about 16%. And that's really as elective procedures have opened up and the backlog of patients has started to be worked through. But coming out of 21 and into 22, I think there's a question of the impact of COVID and what will growth in the sector really look like. But actually forecasts are showing about a 7 or 8% growth rate for next year, which I think really bodes well for the industry as a whole. And that's really supported by the public valuations in the sector and certainly investor confidence. The medtech opportunity has definitely not been lost on investors. And we've seen 128% growth in public valuations. And that's really for the emerging growth companies. You know, if you think about the IPOs and SPACs that have experienced significant market appreciation over the last 18 months. But actually, as a whole, the medtech industry has returned or has given a return to investors of over 50%. And that's really outperforming peers in both pharma and biotech. You know, there's been record investment into the sector. We've seen 34 billion of fresh capital invested. And that's really across the industry. We've seen about 9 billion come from VC funds, 6 billion from IPOs, 4 billion from SPAC. And, you know, that's almost a new class in its own right. And we're only counting in the data there SPACs that have de-SPACed and are actually operating as public companies in their own right now. And then there's been 16 billion of follow-on capital. And a lot of that investment has really gone into R&D, and we're seeing that the industry's innovation engine is very much back on track. We've seen R&D spending approaching about 24 billion, which is an increase of about 17% over the last year. And our clients are telling us that, you know, whilst they've been increasing their R&D spending, a lot of them were quite surprised to hear that that was consistent across the industry. And I think we're seeing a real doubling down on internal programs, and a lot of that capital now is being deployed on those internal programs. And then I think if we think back to where we all saw the industry going about 12 months ago, if we were looking sort of 5 years out, the transformation that's really happened, it has happened over 5 or 6 months due to COVID. And that's really migration of care into the home, migration of diagnostics into the home as well. And really looking at data strategies and patient at the centre, being served where they want to be served. And I think all of these attributes which we saw unfolding over the last year, and I think we will continue to see being a priority for medtechs. And we will touch on these in a little bit more detail this morning, particularly as Adrian mentioned, human at the centre and data and digital migration, and we'll go through those shortly. But going forward, I think there's a couple of other areas that are worth mentioning. And Adrian did touch on these. On the regulatory front, you know, terms like emergency use authorization has become a regular household term for medtech, and that continues. And I think medtech have really got an opportunity now to negotiate a better regulatory framework for the future, and we'll touch on that in a little bit more detail shortly. And then on the supply chain side, we've really seen the markets evolving over the last year, again largely driven by COVID. And we've seen an onshoring within supply chains and a real challenge around the resiliency of the industry supply chains. And I think there's an opportunity, as well as some challenges, to really take the learnings from the last 12 to 18 months and focus on that going forward to really build some more transparent and resilient supply chains. And then finally, I think on the ESG agenda, this is central for medtechs. And I think medtechs really have a positive story to tell. You know, it's one of innovation, it's one of life-saving technology, and I think is central to a lot of medtech's agendas right now. James, can we flip on a slide? So just to give a little bit more granularity, when we look at the increased revenues across the sector, you can see that the industry has moved from about a $3 billion revenue industry to well on its way to $500 billion, which I think is truly incredible. And if you look at 19 and 20, and this is true for 21 as well, the majority of that growth is coming from emerging companies. And I think we expect that to continue through 22. I think that's really exciting because we're seeing some a lot of new companies coming into the sector. We're seeing a lot of new technologies, and that's really driving some significant growth. Flip on a slide, James. Thank you. And if we look at MedTech capitalization by product type, we can clearly see that those companies who are focused on capturing and using data, so really the diagnostic companies, are really driving the growth in the market. And if you look at the second graphic on the screen there, I think what's really interesting, but perhaps not surprising, is the impressive 24% annual growth rate that we've seen from the non-imaging diagnostic companies. And this growth has largely been driven by pandemic-related demand, but forecasts aren't suggesting that this will drop away. I think we're seeing these companies are very much here to stay. If you flip on a slide for me, James. Thank you. And I think I mentioned earlier that the industry's innovation engine is very much back on track. And what this slide shows really is the R&D spending. And if you look, you can see the 17% increase over the past year. And as always, with any sort of increase in R&D spend, there will be a lag of revenue, or a lag in time before the revenue sort of catch up with that increase in R&D. But I think with some of the key trends we've identified this morning, that increase in R&D and that real drive in the industry will start to deliver those increases in revenues and continue to push that incredible revenue well past the $500 billion mark over the next few years. And I think, paired with the focus of some of the other themes we'll talk about this morning, there's a real opportunity for this sector to continue on this growth journey. So as I said, some really interesting themes that we'll go into a little bit more detail on. If I pass to James, I think we'll dive into human-centric.
Yeah, thanks very much, Laura. So as Adrian mentioned at the beginning, we've kind of picked out some of the mega trends that we think are reshaping the sector as it rebounds from COVID. And as Laura's run through of the metrics there shows, the MedTech industry has come back really strongly. That there wasn't actually a revenue dip in calendar year terms, although there was a hit in the first half of last year. And in part, I think that's because the industry has proved so adaptable in terms of its care delivery models. And when we were putting together the Pulse of the Industry report, we talked to a few key stakeholders in the industry. And in particular, we had an interesting discussion with Gio Di Napoli, who's president of GI at Medtronic, who talked about the way that at-home diagnostic tests are increasingly preferred by patients because they need less time and logistics than going to a bricks and mortar care site. And I think this is something that people have been aware of for many years, that there's lots of inconvenience, there's lots of friction in the traditional patient care journey. But there hasn't really, until the last year or so, been that very strong cross-industry imperative to really move away from that towards a more digitally enabled remote care model of how you provide diagnostics and how you provide therapeutics. And obviously that imperative has really strongly been there since early 2020. And we've seen companies like Medtronic embracing that. So in terms of the GI products that Medtronic were discussing, this is to do with colonoscopies and the fact that you can now send the technology for doing colonoscopy to the patient's house and use the technology to do that work remotely, rather than bringing the patient into a care site, which is quite time consuming, very difficult when you have segregation of hospitals to protect the COVID patients. And this is just one example among many of how especially diagnostics have really adapted to the circumstances of the last year and have become something that's much more available and much more accessible remotely. And another interesting discussion that we heard was around the 10.5 billion, I believe, Baxter acquisition of Hillrom. And Hillrom, as you know, is a big connected care specialist. And Baxter investing so much into making that acquisition, we saw as a really big kind of signpost to how seriously the major medtechs are now taking the requirement to be able to deliver connected care, to be able to deliver care through non-conventional, non-traditional channels. And the way that Baxter and Hillrom have spoken about this deal, emphasizes that that's really the focus, that the use of digital technologies to expand access and the way that the care landscape has changed so rapidly have really put that at the top of the agenda for so many of these companies. And so when we were considering these changes and the way that the industry has shifted so rapidly, we used this phrase, humans at the center. And, you know, for years, people have spoken about patient centricity as a goal in the life sciences. And despite that, I think we all know that it's not something that's ever really matured or taken shape as yet, that we still have a very fragmented care system that's driven by, you know, having multiple lines of care with complex referrals between them, you know, difficult segregation in the patient journey, and then also complex data flows between the different facilitators of care. And this is something that I think is almost universally recognized, but something that no one has really had a holistic solution to before. And we haven't, you know, jumped from there to the holistic solution. But the thing that we've heard in our conversations with clients over the last couple of years is just how accelerated that journey towards joining up care, towards using digital enablement to make it smoother, how much that has happened just in the last 2 years, despite the fact that it's been spoken about for the last decade. We heard this phrase over and over again in our roundtable discussions about, you know, we made 5 years progress in 5 months. Was a kind of repeated, you know, talking point that would come up, that everybody had these plans to make things more digitally enabled, to capture data better, to push towards remote care and mobile care, much more than we have in the past. But it's really taken COVID lighting a fire under the industry to make this leap start to happen. And now we have actually seen those steps being taken. We can sort of step back and think, where is the actual, you know, end point for this journey that the industry is now on? And, you know, in the past, people have spoken about the idea of the platform digital companies that have reshaped other industries, whether that's in retail or accommodation or travel. We've really seen the potential of those very seamless, convenient, highly personalized, you know, digital engines that facilitate transactions. And, you know, over the years, we've tried to pick out the kind of characteristics that cut across the digital leaders in those different sectors and see where they can be applied in healthcare. And I think all of these, what we've termed winning characteristics, are things that are not where healthcare has excelled in the past. You know, obviously the technologies that are deployed within healthcare are incredibly sophisticated. The R&D investment, as Laura's pointed out, which is now going up again in MedTech, is you know, it's a very credible proportion of capital allocation within life sciences compared to other industries. But you know, the innovation in MedTech and in the broader life sciences has gone towards, you know, product development, which has, you know, left less space for the development of the user experience characteristics that have been so important in other industries. And so, you know, as we push towards a more digital format for health, we start to see, you know, the opportunities to build in some of these features into the way care is delivered. So I think, you know, digital delivery has the potential to make things more seamless. Capturing data certainly allows care to become more predictive and personalized. I think in a way, this kind of reaching out to at-home care models is consumerizing care in a way that wasn't done before, and bringing in you know, stronger options for consumer choice and personalized preferences. And of course, that's building the convenience of care. And then you know, the transparency issue is one that I'll touch on a bit more in the next trend that I talk about, which is more around data. But I think there's the potential for care to become much more based on communication between the patient and the care providers as we move towards a world where it's much more driven by real world data, captured in real time and in real life settings. So we're not saying we're at the point where we have the Amazon of healthcare or the Airbnb of healthcare, or some of these hype phrases that people have used in the last few years. I mean, I don't think we are pushing towards that yet. but we're starting to see how some of those characteristics that have made those companies so successful in other fields can actually be evolved and developed within a healthcare setting as well. And I think that's very powerful for future options for how companies can look at their own market offerings. And then, so in terms of where we've seen these initiatives, there have obviously been multiple different stories this year, and I touched on Baxter and Hillrom, which is an important one. I was really interested in the Zimmer Biomet Persona IQ approval. You probably have heard plenty about this already, but it's the first really of what's being termed smart implants. So it's in this case a smart orthopedic knee, which will do the work of a standard orthopedic knee, but also has greater scope to capture data. And as I'm sure you're aware, this is become a very hot button topic in orthopedics, and it's not just Zimmer, but Stryker and many of the other big companies who are now moving towards creating not just products, but products that can capture data and feed that data to physicians. So rather than just making the single intervention with the product, you're setting up a kind of care relationship where the product is going to stream data back and give the physicians more information in order to manage the patient's care journey. And, I think that's really interesting because that use of data to change the way that care is delivered is something that we've seen in MedTech in the past in certain chronic disease areas, especially diabetes, which has always been the kind of the pace setter, I think, for using digital tools to improve care. But I think seeing it in a field like orthopedics, which has been so product and procedure driven in the past, is a real shift. And I think it's only the tip of the iceberg. I think we're going to see that move towards capturing and using data and making improvements to care based on that across the field of all the different therapeutic areas. But I think that's a really interesting kind of straw in the wind. We've also seen initiatives like Roche using remote data capture to enable remote clinical trials. So rather than, again, bringing patients in to a care setting to take samples and record data, some of the initiatives that Roche, among other companies, are pursuing gives you much more scope to capture real world data in a home setting, which potentially could be revolutionary for clinical trials. We all know that one of the big difficulties with clinical trials is simply recruiting the number of patients that you need across different care sites. I think if you have the potential to capture that data remotely, then you can really accelerate and optimize how that's done. We also in 2020, of course, saw the Teladoc acquisition of Livongo, which I mean, I think people have had a bit more time to process that one, but it's a huge marker nonetheless, for a telehealth company to pay so much for a digital care provider like Livongo. It really showed the level of excitement in that field, and moreover, like the ability to integrate different remote care tools. So not just like telehealth as a connection to physicians, but also the digital chronic care management that's offered by a system like Livongo's. And I think that's going to be something that we see growing in importance. Obviously, telehealth has been one of the areas of remote care that's most been accelerated since COVID. Telehealth is something that's existed for a long time, but has never really had mass mainstream take up until now. And now it really does. And there's going to be some work needed to lock in that shift that gives patients that convenient access to care from a home setting. But it's something that we've taken that first step, and now we just have to proceed on that journey and lock it in. And I think companies like Teladoc beginning to integrate some of those capabilities is a big step along that path. We've also seen companies like Pear Therapeutics who built the digital pill, which can capture information. So a similar mentality to the smart implants. It's a way of creating a product that captures data. And they have partnered with eTechDRX to build a new platform for putting together digital therapeutics. So actual therapeutics that are delivered via a digital medium, such as the the Blue Star Diagnostics, the Blue Star Diabetes therapeutic that was developed by WellDoc. And you know, there's a few others that have gained regulatory approval, but they've proved that digital devices can deliver care as effectively as traditional drugs and traditional medical device hardware. So you know, I think things like this initiatives, Teladoc and Livongo, Pair Therapeutics and eTechDirect, really show how some of these digital fields are coming together. And I also think we've seen great ingenuity in some of the companies that are building the diagnostics infrastructure around COVID. Color Health has been a name that's come up a lot, but companies that have really sought to broaden the accessibility and convenience of the way that we've built our testing infrastructure. And that's obviously something that's been hugely important in the last 2 years, and I think something that's ongoingly going to be an issue. So I think in all these ways, you've seen you know, companies involved in MedTech stepping up and building tools which can increase convenience and access, can allow much more seamless capture and transition of data, and that all, you know, point towards the ways that we can look to evolve this human-centered model of care. So that's how we see that trend developing. And in terms of where we see companies needing to put in the investment and the focus, obviously the technical capabilities to provide this remote care are really important. When we talk to life sciences companies, we find that in some respects, medtech companies have more capability in this space than pharma companies do, because they're more used to working with hardware and software. In some ways, they're more a natural fit with data collection and use. But you know, there's still work to be done in many areas to build up that digital skill and those data science skills that can really make this remote care a reality. And I think it can't just be an add-on to the traditional, the legacy operating models. I think we need companies to rethink, once you incorporate these technologies, how can you from the ground up imagine how to do care? And I think that there may be new business models, new operating possibilities that we haven't seen in the past, that will be enabled by the more intelligent use of digital technologies, data, and even the broader base of diagnostics that we now have in the market. And of course, I think rethinking the operating models is not something that the life sciences companies can do on their own. It's obviously something that involves close collaboration with health systems, with payers, with patients, not least importantly, and with the various other companies they'll need to partner with to make this a reality. So I think these are the areas that we'd advise companies to focus on in trying to build up their capabilities in that space. And as I say, like a big theme that runs through that is around data and digital. And obviously I've brought this up several times already, but I think this is, you know, such an important point that we really need to discuss it a bit further in terms of, you know, the possibilities for transforming the operating model. So I think, first of all, everyone realizes that there's, you know, an unprecedented, to say the least, a really unimaginable amount of data now in the healthcare system. And this is basically a truism, but I mean, when people try to quantify it, it's still slightly hard to understand, like the level of data that's now being generated across the patient care journey. And that's because as time goes on, increasingly everything that we interact with is generating and capturing data. So we're used to thinking in terms of, you know, electronic health records in provider systems, or clinical trials data, which are, you know, established sources for you know, medical data. But now we increasingly have the potential to capture data from any number of apps, wearables, smart devices, genetics, genomics, other omics. There's a huge amount of data streams around any individual patient before you even get to the various fields of, you know, registry data, claims data, and socioeconomic and demographic data. And I think everyone's aware that all of these data streams feed into the overall picture. I think what's always been the issue in the past is that it's very difficult to put this data together for various reasons. Firstly, it's technically difficult to join data which is in different formats, which is structured and unstructured, which is very heterogeneous, in short, into a single space. There's also, you know, the fact that it's heavily regulated across the life sciences, and obviously different regulations in different geographies, different regulations on different data streams. But in any instance, I mean, the regulatory barriers around data um, transfer within the life sciences are really high compared to other industries, and that's an established issue. I think you also have patient reluctance, because there isn't necessarily huge trust between patients and life sciences companies. Perhaps less of an issue in medtech than in pharma, actually, but that's always been a kind of barrier, at least with a subset of patients, that has to be negotiated. And then moreover, I think you've got a kind of cultural legacy of data protection within the life sciences, where data is seen primarily as a proprietary asset, as trade secrets that have to be secured as much as possible. And I think making use of data in a more intelligent way means joining it up. And this is a big psychological step, I think, for lots of companies to take, because it means releasing some of the grip on the data that they own themselves in order to be able to integrate that data across the ecosystem with the data held by others. But I think where we've seen early work in building digital data-driven care models, we've seen how effective this can be. And I come back to diabetes, which I mentioned earlier as the kind of the pioneer in digital health. And I think diabetes has also been a kind of pioneer in interoperability, where we now see companies like Dexcom and Tandem building systems that can interact with each other. As a venture investor in MedTech told us a couple of years ago, the attitude in MedTech has always been, if you could make your device with a plug that nobody else could use, should be your standard operating procedure, because you just want to make everybody locked into your own products as much as you possibly can. And I think diabetes, where we have so many interacting devices, from continuous glucose monitors to smart pumps to apps that are capturing patient data, etc., 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 has really shown the fallacy of that mindset, and shown that you can achieve a lot more by building integration and interoperability between different devices. And I think we've also seen the approval of like cloud technologies in diabetes that can allow smoother interaction between these different devices in the last year or so. So that's been a real pioneer, as I say. And I think across digital health, there are so many different niches where different devices can fit. And we've kind of broken them out as a schematic here. But the key point to take home from this is just that there are many different areas across the patient journey where digital technologies driven by data offer something to the patient. But the point is that it is a care journey, and it is a patient. It's not just a single interaction. And that's why I think the interoperability of these devices to bring this care journey together, to offer that care in a much more holistic fashion, is something really important. So we talk about the potential to monitor and to collect data, the potential to diagnose and treat, but really all of these things feed into each other, and the technologies need to speak to each other. So I think that's something that's important to understand. Companies don't need to own the whole digital patient journey. They need to find a niche where they fit in, but within that niche, they need to interact with the other companies that are providing care or services in that space, and they need to bring it together. We need ultimately to have a lot of integration within the system if it's going to deliver care effectively. And I think one big issue that comes up with that is around cybersecurity, which is something, again, that at EY we've talked about a lot and convened various roundtables to discuss with the industry. And I think cybersecurity at the moment is a recognized issue for MedTech, but maybe it's still a little peripheral. It's something that's still seen as a particular function that has to be addressed within the company. And I think we need to understand it much more as a kind of a high-level strategic imperative that devices have to be built in a way that enables them to be joined to other devices, to be connected up to care systems, and to be able to share data across all of those stakeholders if we're going to successfully reinvent how care is delivered. So there's lots of ongoing discussions about that, and I think it's going to be a really important part of how this data-driven digital care system will come together in the future. So I think that's one of our key recommendations to companies on the data side, is that there needs to be much more collaboration with regulators and with other stakeholders like healthcare providers around cybersecurity. There needs also to be systems for sharing data, and we've, again, between EY and clients, we've discussed the use of trusted research environments, data brokerages, and other ways that data can be shared. And I think this is something that's still very much at a kind of a mass pilot stage, but it's something that needs to happen. And I think companies need to work together to find ways of enabling that cross usage of data. And that's going to involve, better channels of communication between even companies and their competitors, which might have been unthinkable 10 years ago. But I don't think we can really afford to have people working in silos in that way anymore. I think there needs to be much more alignment and much more alliance between the different companies in the medtech space, even across therapeutic areas as we go forward. And in terms of that collaboration, I think Laura touched on this briefly earlier, but I think another theme which we've found really important in the last year is around regulatory changes. And obviously, COVID tore up the rulebook in lots of ways for medtech regulation. Laura mentioned the emergency use authorizations, of which there was simply an unprecedented number in 2020 as the FDA scrambled devices into the US market to deal with COVID. But I think, in a way, there's a broader set of changes going on in medtech regulation. I think our feedback from clients has been that the regulators, not just the FDA, but including them, have been very, willing to discuss and negotiate how regulation should work during this crisis situation. And I think that level of communication and that willingness to rethink, if necessary, how regulation should be applied within the sector is something that the industry should take forward, and that could be really powerful in building the basis for a more human-centered, a more digitally driven care model in future. And I think to touch on some specific points, we talked about telehealth and how much that's grown. Obviously, that was enabled by coverage being extended in America, so that telehealth could be reimbursed across different states. And there's obviously negotiations ongoing about how to lock that in and to make that something that's future-proofed. And obviously, there's some pushback there. So I think that's an area where the regulation is still under debate. Likewise, the Biden administration has talked a lot about acute hospital care at home, and the goal of making care remotely accessible. So I think that's something that we will be looking to see how that gets represented in legislation. Biden's administration also repealed the MCIT regulation, which was going to propose immediate reimbursement for very innovative technologies. It'll be interesting to see if that resurfaces in some shape or form, but it would be an interesting incentive for innovation in medtech. And then I think there's also interesting discussions going on around operational funding for the FDA out of medtech's user fees and where that should be going. And I think digital transformation is a big part of the agenda there. And I think as with these other discussions, that will really feed into how the care system is shaping for the future. I think it does need that policymaker and regulatory buy-in to make these changes effective. But I think that's been shown to be something that's not impossible in the last couple of years. And so hopefully those conversations will continue. And so we're really counseling companies to continue working with regulators to lock in the potential, for example, for the faster launches that we saw in the pandemic, to consolidate that shift towards home-based care that we've been discussing, to make that an ongoing reality, and to work with the regulators to make the approval pathways a reality for things like the digital therapeutics we mentioned, for AI algorithms and other really new technologies where we don't have a traditional framework for regulating and approving them. There are many proposals, and the FDA has already reached out to companies, and there's been plenty of discussions about this. But I think that's an area where more work needs to be done, and the industry needs to be heavily involved in talking to the regulators around that. And then another area where regulators have been somewhat involved is around the supply chain. And I think I'm going to hand back to Laura to quickly discuss the issues that have been developing there.
Thanks, James. I think you're right. I think supply chain is another area that COVID has really shone a spotlight on over the last 18 months. The pandemic crisis really highlighted concerns around the supply of key devices in times of global disruption. And we've touched on regulatory policy there, and we don't yet know how global regulatory policy will end up reacting to the supply chain disruption. We have seen to an extent some more onshoring. Will that continue for key supply networks? But I think what is clear out of the last 18 months is really there's an opportunity as well as a challenge to rethink supply chains so that they can deliver that human-centric kind of data-driven care models that we're anticipating and starting to see. If you flip on a slide for me, we've got a slide here that shows a rough idea of how a future supply chain model for MedTech could really work. And the key point here is really it's integrated so that it brings together many partners from the manufacturers to the payers to the patients. And it allows a dynamic network in which products and services alongside data and insights are rapidly shared to allow for flexible delivery models. And I think whilst we've seen a move towards this over the last 18 months, the industry is far from that at present. Typical MedTech supply chains are asset heavy, that really lack the flexibility and don't have the ability to move quickly. MedTechs typically hold a significant amount of redundant inventory from orthopedic devices through to just loose instruments. But I think if the industry could better translate the demand signals in the supply chain, embrace data, so use AI analytics for better forecasting and build greater flexibility, this could significantly downsize the amount of redundant inventory. And I think a lot of what we're seeing around the challenges in the supply chain is really data-driven problems. If we can move towards a more data-rich care environment, we might be able to start to generate some of the data that can help fill in the blanks in that supply chain modelling and allow companies to be more reactive. And I think, on the disruption side, there's more scope for MedTechs to work directly with suppliers, potentially cut out the sales companies that have typically been intermediaries in these supply chains and allow businesses to build integrated business, planning it into the supply chain strategies to really accommodate the industry's long lead time that we often see. And there have been some great examples over the last 18 months where MedTechs have taken supply chain initiatives. Baxter's a good example where they deployed a cloud-based digital infrastructure to stimulate demand for their renal therapy devices. And that really used data modelling to understand the location of their critical patients, to increase their manufacturing capacity and then accelerate the shopping times. We've also seen Siemens Healthineers. Back in July 2020, they signed a contract with DHL focused on digital technology and robotics with the goal of really building an end-to-end digitally enabled supply chain solution. So MedTechs are moving towards these more flexible supply chains. But I think the long-term goal for the industry really has to be faster, more transparent and more agile supply chain strategies that can really take the data that James has talked us through there. There's an abundance of data in the sector. And if we can use that data, we can really start to deliver integrated care solutions, which combine the traditional products and services, but bring them to the consumer wherever they are. So whether that's at home or in more traditional bricks and mortar settings of hospitals. But I think we're far from that at present, and MedTech can't just jump from where we are right now into this idealized supply chain. But I think there are a number of tactical steps that businesses can really take. If you flip on for me, James. I think we first need to ensure that supply chains are able to withstand future hits like COVID. We all hope we don't have another situation like this, but I think what it has highlighted is that current supply chains just aren't as resilient as perhaps we need them to be. And I think if we don't see the industry take that opportunity to build those resilient supply chains, then policymakers are likely to put controls in place around globalized supply chains to make sure that there is resilience in the system, and that could ultimately increase cost and logistical demand. And therefore, I think if MedTech can embrace this opportunity now, you can potentially avoid that. But the key to all of this, I think, is going to be the transparency and using that data to ensure that there is transparency in the supply chain. We've spoken to MedTech CEOs over the last 18 months at a number of events, and really what we were told was until the crisis, a lot of these companies didn't really have an insight into their own supplier base. Companies just didn't need to know. It wasn't something that was needed to be thought about. But actually, it was when the COVID crisis hit that and suppliers were started to be disrupted, that in some cases, businesses realized that they were really heavily dependent on a really narrow range of sources for materials, and that ultimately, to build resilience, they needed to diversify that supplier base in the future. And I think in general, it's fair to say that the industry doesn't really have optimal supply chain visibility in either direction. We don't have great oversight of the supply base, but equally we don't have a detailed real-time knowledge of the market demand and where the demand is coming, which would really enable more demand based distribution. So thinking about if we could forecast that demand is going to increase in one area, that might allow us to increase manufacturing quickly enough to be able to meet that demand further down the line. So I think there's an opportunity in an increasing data-rich world to build that transparency, but MedTech really have to step away from the traditional assumptions around how a life science supply chain works, which typically is very slow and heavily regulated. But if we take the learnings of the last 18 months and we look at the way Pfizer or BioNTech really stood up their supply chains for the COVID vaccine, there was no precedent for this. It was something that they've never had to do. They had to develop a vaccine alongside standing up a complex supply chain. And I think everyone will agree vaccine supply chains are some of the most complex supply chains out there. Yet these companies managed within a number of months to build successful supply chain operations alongside the clinical development of the vaccines. So it can be done. And I think taking the learnings from that, there is much more scope to improve the speed and flexibility with which MedTech supply chains can operate. And I think the other thing that I would highlight from the last 18 months and something that MedTech really should focus on is partnerships, partnering better and having a wider range of collaborators within the ecosystem that enable the supply chain operations to be more robust and ultimately more flexible. I think over the last 12 months, we've seen much more flexibility and much more innovative ways of partnering because it's been the only way to deliver what was needed, but actually taking those learnings and not allowing the industry to go back to the slower and perhaps more analog ways of working is going to be really important as we move forward as an industry. So I think there's some key themes there that do link back to the human-centric and the data and digital strategies of business. But ultimately, I think the key thing on the supply chain front is really all about transparency and using that data.
Laura, you just mute yourself.
Oh, I don't know how I did that. Sorry, I was just saying, I think the key thing is really taking the data that's available, understanding that these ecosystems need to be better partnered. They need to be built ultimately to be more resilient and built on transparency. So that was everything from me. I think the last theme that we called out that we mentioned at the beginning was around sustainability, and I'll hand over to Adrian just to take us through that. Adrian, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm just having a few technical issues to blow my screen up. So yeah, I wasn't proposing to cover a great deal here, to be honest with you. I think what I would say is on sustainability, that I think what's imperative is that, as with all areas and particular areas of business at the moment, and particularly with those that are intensive in terms of materials, high quality materials required, lengthy supply chains, the need to use materials. I think the drivers of sustainability and the need for that in terms of healthcare companies and others are demanded by the various stakeholders in and around the business. So investors, regulators, patients, and everybody is looking and wanting to ensure that sustainable business practices are included. Not only do these, as in a general sense for all businesses, are needed for, ensuring stakeholder alignment, there's a key here around ensuring that it helps with longer term margins and societal impacts. So I think you can see on the slide here some of the key drivers and why they're important. But I think I would just repeat, and that the longer term drivers of sustainability are no different in sustainability in the medtech industry as to any others as well. So I think they're equally valid. But with that, I think that probably then draws to a conclusion what we wanted to address in terms of the detailed areas of the report. And I think I would just, unless Laura and James, you wanted to say anything else at this juncture, I was just going to conclude with a few closing remarks on things to consider. So I think the key things for me, I think what we've heard and from the presentation today is the impact of COVID and the changes that's having on the industry. It has led to an acceleration, but I think the core themes, even beyond the 5 that we've got on here, are a backdrop of societal impacts and changes of aging populations, pressures on healthcare budgets, people, both politicians and patients, expecting more for less, healthcare budgets getting more constrained as pharmaceuticals companies move away from their white pill model. And I think what we're seeing is a nuanced evolution here of patient-centric, digital harnessed technologies that really improve the outlook for patients and healthcare outcomes, which is, of course, the longer-term goal. And I think that all the developments, including things like earlier patient intervention, the remote monitoring, the ability even to do a colonoscopy remotely, all of these innovations and technologies are really, I think, longer term lead to earlier healthcare interventions, better outcomes for patients, and help reduce healthcare costs. So they're all moving in that direction. But I think on this slide, against that backdrop, there's some really interesting questions for medtech companies to consider. So, what does the future look like post COVID-19, and how do you position your company as part of that? How do people keep the innovation engines running and secure value from M&A despite the very high valuations? And this third box, of course, really important. I think trust is a really important aspect of today's sort of business agenda, not least, in my sector, in the audit space, but more broadly, there's more focus and emphasis on this than ever before. And so I think that's really important. And finally, how are you going to measure progress in environmental and social and governance factors, and communicating that to your customers and investors, but also broader stakeholders that I think are ever more important than just your delivering shareholder value. So I think, I'd say, well, thanks very much to Laura and James for running us through, but I can see our chat box is pretty empty on the question front. Are there any questions for Laura and James, or indeed me, at this point?
I think it's Monday morning. People are a bit cold or shy, but yeah,
that's fine.
If I may, just in case anything drops in the middle. So, well, thanks a lot. That was an amazing coverage of how future really look like, and obviously the key word I'm hearing here, that's data at all level, whether that's to enable this human centricity or on the supply chain aspect. So what would you say is the biggest bottleneck to enable more data in MedTech in general? Is it, I don't know, is it the technology itself that need to be brought in? Is it the skills? Lots of things we're hearing from companies is the capacity to attract the right, data scientist skill and not necessarily with a life science background. I don't know, is it the cash capacity? Is it the regulatory framework around that? I know it's a little bit of everything, but if you had to pick one main one, which one would you say it is?
Yeah, so I think it is a bit of everything, which is not a very satisfying answer. But, I think so. There are technical. I mean, I sort of skimmed over this a bit when I was talking about it, but there are technical difficulties even within a company. If you have data that's held in legacy systems, it's difficult to integrate it. It's a technical challenge. As you say, there's data scientists are at a premium, and nobody has enough data scientists, so that's always tricky. And then
do we train them well enough, the data scientists?
I think probably we do now, but obviously there's a lag. So obviously it's a very sought after profession now, and I'm sure the numbers will work their way through. But I think there's been a shortage because the market demand has been so high, and that takes a while to correct. And I think there's scope for medtech companies to partner with data specialists as well. And I think it's a fallacy to think that everything needs to be done in-house, or that companies need to be able to have all that expertise internally. I think one theme that comes up a lot when we talk about this is just that as things become so complex and so sophisticated in terms of the number of data streams and the number of technologies that are linking together, increasingly we don't think that medtech companies can take the burden of all of that on themselves. And what they need to do instead, as I think Laura mentioned, in terms of supply chain, but I think it applies more broadly, is linking up with other partners, having very agile, intelligent partnerships across the ecosystem to bring in some of those capabilities. And I think that there are other issues. Regulatory barriers, as I say, are high. There's resistance from some patients. Some patients are very keen to share data. Some patients are very keen not to. But I think the fundamental thing is there has to be a commitment to using data and sharing data and integrating data on the parts of companies. And as I say, I think there's real cultural resistance to that. It's not how things have traditionally been done. And sometimes companies will see it as giving away a resource, which is obviously unacceptable. But I think you have to see it not as giving away a resource, but as actually opening a relationship which allows you to do more. Because if you can integrate bigger sources of data, you can understand more about patients, you can deliver better outcomes, in the same way that better sharing of information between companies is what you need really to build ecosystem cybersecurity, rather than just cybersecurity on a medical device. So I think the more companies embrace that, the more collective strength the industry has to deliver these kinds of changes.
Thanks.
James, I was just going to ask, in the work that you've done, I mean, how do people cope with the sort of, there's always more unstructured data than structured, and it's the unstructured data, I guess, that's harder to analyze and harder to deal with. I mean, are there any particular, we see this in other more broader technology sectors, attempts to deal with this issue, but is there anything you've seen in this particular space where people
it's an issue, and it's a well-established issue, and there are many companies working on it from many different angles. So we were talking to an AI company only a couple of days ago who were working with bringing together registry and claims data with medical notes, and then with formal EHRs, and they're very heterogeneous data sources, and it's a hard problem, but companies are finding ways of working around it. And I think I think on the technical side, as an industry and as a wider society, our technical skills are always increasing. So I think those problems, even the ones which are very difficult now, they come within scope within a few years. It's having the commitment to needing to use that data and to making the necessary effort to access it that I think we have to work on.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thanks, James. And just looking at the clock, it's 11:01. So just coming to a draw. So there's no burning questions from the audience chat box. I think we're going to conclude here. So really, really big thank you to you, James, Adrian, and Laura for this amazing presentation. I think that's a really well spent hour for understanding how the sector is evolving and will evolve. Just to mention,
Thank
the
you for
session
having
was
us.
recorded.
It looks like you've got a question in here.
Oh,
Is that
right.
pen?
Sorry?
It looks like we've got a question. Somebody had their hand up. Maybe it's gone down now.
Uh-huh.
It was just a clap, but also to say I really enjoyed your talk. It's not my area, so I don't have any questions. But also to say your chat was disabled. That might be why you have no questions.
Oh, great. Thank you for highlighting that.
Good to know.
Well, okay. So if anyone had a question anyway, that's what I wanted to mention. So James, Adrian, and Laura's colleague Ruby, Sharon Khan, is attending the digital conference. So she's on the app. So if you have any follow-up or if you would like to discuss a bit further with the team on how you can engage on these questions, she's very happy to take meeting requests and take questions. And I'll check this chat function after we close that. But obviously, do get in touch with Ruby, and I'm sure she will forward to colleagues. So thanks a lot for attending. And also this session was recorded and that will be available to Genesis delegates on the app from next week once the whole week is finished. And so you can get back to it and digest a bit more the data, etc. So big thank you, everyone. And I hope to see you at other innovation workshops or Genesis Live for those who are coming on Thursday. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks
Bye.
all.